Hello, welcome to this episode of Quakerism. In this episode, I'm wanting to look at something that's a really important phrase in in Quakerism in Britain. Trying to look at what it means, because seemingly it means different things to everyone, and trying to piece all that together, and ultimately working out whether or not it matters that it means different things to different people. So that phrase that we're talking about today is that of God in everyone. You will probably not have lasted very long as a Quaker in Britain without hearing that phrase come up either in your reading or in vocal ministry, maybe in meeting. And so, what does it mean? Because it sounds quite straightforward, but I tell you now, this is my third attempt at this video. So it is actually quite complicated because it's quite fluid and it seems quite simple, but the minute that people start talking about it and what they mean by it, it all falls apart. So let's try and work out what it is. So yes, first off, I am not trying to find in this video the actual definition of this phrase because it doesn't exist. And so, and I'm not even actually advocating one phrase, one interpretation of the phrase, that of God and everyone, over any other either. I think all of them have something that is true in Quakerism, and all of them are completely valid. And actually, the complexity of different meanings piling up onto one another when using this word can actually be quite helpful. And I think this is why words and phrases like the inner light, which I've talked in another video about before, can be quite useful in Quakerism because it can cover quite a lot of different meanings for quite a few different people. So um, I'm not advocating one phrase, one interpretation of the phrase over another. I don't think ultimately it matters that there is a big difference, but I think it's important to say that because uh, it's a very important phrase and I don't want to ruin it for anyone. So if you were to ask probably modern day Quakers, if you bumped into one on the street, look at you, and ask them, what does that of God and everyone mean? You're probably going to hear something along the lines of that it is related to integral value in everyone. That regardless of who you are, where you are, what you believe, you have integral worth, and that is related to the divine if you go down that avenue, or it is that everyone is equal, everyone is valuable to humanity. If you look at perhaps a video which I'll put on this from Quakers in Britain, from the Quakers in Britain YouTube page, they talk about it, you seeing that which is sacred and precious in everyone. And so it's this idea that we have integral worth. And if we look at other people under that rubric, it helps us to create a community maybe as it should be. If we're seeing that of God in everyone and treating everyone as if they had that of God in everyone, then what would the community look like there? I suppose also modern Quakers would probably see it as synonymous with the phrase the inner light. I've done a video on that. And so I think most Quakers would probably see them as pretty similar phrases, that it's basically relating to our inner ability to communicate with God or the divine, and that we can, and that because we all have that connection, we are all equal. In the video I mentioned as well from Quakers in Britain, they called that integral value, that sacredness in every human, to uh, to come to an idea of radical inclusion, that it makes no difference who you are, where you're born, of what social ranking you are, what languages you speak, what religion you believe in. You are all included in this idea of having that of God in you. In a Quaker Speak video, I watched someone talking about that of God and everyone, and they too had this idea of connection, that we are connected to each other through this um, that of God in everyone. That because we all have that, we can all connect on a way that we can't on really any other level. If we speak different languages, we can't connect. If even sometimes we come from different generations, we can't connect. We feel that nowadays it's so easy not to be able to connect with people, that actually to come down to this idea of that of God in us, and that is something that we can all be equal to, can be that's quite uplifting. Thank goodness there's something that we actually all have that we can all agree on. But where does it come from? What's its position in Quakerism, and how did it become such an important phrase? Because actually, for the longest time, actually for a large part of Quaker history, this phrase was not known at all, or very rarely used in the way that it now is. So where's that come from, and why was it that it was left alone, and why did it come back again? So it should probably come without saying that this is a phrase that comes from George Fox, and he mentions it a couple of times, and so did quite a few other early Quakers, but they said a whole lot of things. But why? So what was important about this phrase? So the phrase where it's most often quoted from is from the letters of the Journal of George Fox, and it's quoted in the Vices and Queries. It's right at the end, and it goes like this: "Be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you come, that your carriage and life may preach among all sorts of people, and to them. Then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone." So George Fox said that in his journal, and early Quakers said similar things. I think I read somewhere recently that Margaret Fell had a similar phrase as well that she used. But then it quickly went away and wasn't really reused again until the 20th century. So I suppose the first thing to think is, well, what was he saying? That sounds all very lovely. This idea of preaching to everyone, and that sort of, it does have that sort of connectedness to it. Um, that we can walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God and everyone. Um, it does have this idea of a wider community of people. Um, but I think we're getting a bit lost in the language, and I think one of the difficult things with this quote is that it is shortened down to its shortest form. We look at it as that of God and everyone, and treat it as that is it. That's the quote. There it is. Let's try and pile on meaning onto it. When actually we've got a whole passage there, and some people think, well, actually that passage is too short to try and understand what George Fox was trying to say. So what was George Fox trying to say? Well, in describing or trying to work out what George Fox says about anything, the best person to go to is probably Lewis Benson. Lewis Benson probably still is the best Quaker theologian on George Fox. He was particularly riling against previous interpretations of George Fox. So he was writing in the mid 20th century, early mid late early mid 20th century, and he was writing against interpretations from the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, which we'll come to as well because it's quite important. So what did he say that George Fox was trying to say? He's not actually, he believes that George Fox wasn't actually saying doctrinally, as it has sort of become in Quakerism today, that there is that of God in everyone, because this only actually, these examples of this being used in a quote tends to come from a pastoral perspective rather than from George Fox extrapolating Quaker belief. It normally comes from him talking about what we should do as Quakers in amongst each other, amongst other people. It's not a belief. It's about how we should treat people, how we should act. And Lewis Benson focuses in particular on the idea of responding to that of God, answering that of God in everyone, removing the focus from the phrase that of God in everyone, which is great. But he says what George Fox was more interested in was the idea of responding or answering that of God in everyone. And the idea that by answering that of God, we are listening to the light, we are listening to God, we are listening to the divine and what it wants us to do, rather maybe than what the more modern connotation is that we see this equal value on other people, or we see other people as the same as us. In this idea, it's the responding, it's the answering which is more important. And I do think that's true. And I think in maybe the modern interpretation, that's lost, the idea that we should respond to that. I was actually also reading in the Friends Journal, which is, well, I think it's kind of like the Friend in America. But anyway, I was reading that, and there was an article in there on that of God and everyone. I was like, oh, great, good, help me out a bit. And they said on there that we've got to look at the actual term answering as well, because that's not as simple as you think either. Answering in the 17th century, yes, did have the meaning of responding to a question, for example, that is an answer. But an answer also had the meaning of being responsible for or echoing as well. And I really like that, especially if we're fitting that with Benson's idea that this is a pastoral call, not necessarily a doctrinal position, that we should be responsible for that of God and everyone, that we should be echoing that of God and everyone. It's not about us and at the center of things. It's that of God in everyone. Everyone else is there around us, and we are responsible for that, and we are echoing that, and then we can walk cheerfully over the world. It's not a case that we go out and see things that are the same as us and think, oh well, isn't that nice? It's more about noticing um, noticing other people, responding to other people, being responsible for other people as well, which I thought was a certainly not an understanding of it that I had understood. And if you think a bit like that, then we've got to take the idea that I don't think we can answer that of God in everyone straight away. I don't think we're going to be able to echo that of God in everyone straight away. I don't think that's necessarily something that we as fallible humans necessarily have the ability to do automatically. I think that is something that takes time and it takes listening. Um, so we've got to be humble with that. We've got to reach a stage of moral understanding and human understanding in order to partake with other people. So I think then the next thing we've got to look at as well with this term is what does it mean in terms of Quakerism in the 21st century. The phrase that of God and everyone is normally used as well as a way of exemplifying religious pluralism, so that it doesn't matter on your faith necessarily because you have that of God in you. And every human has the ability to be to access the divine um, experientially or experimentally, as the early friends were using, were saying. And so, because of that, it does allow for the universalist position on religious pluralism within Quakerism. So we can say that we all have access to that of God. We might do that accessing in a slightly different way, but we are all there and all have that ability to connect to it immediately. And on the maybe Quaker Christian side as well, you could also look at that as an element of universal redemption and the idea that everyone can be saved and go to heaven if you want to go down that way. Because if everyone has that of God and everyone, even if people haven't heard of Jesus, even if people weren't Christians, even if they they didn't go to church or whatever, take the sacraments, if they listened to that of God and everyone and nurtured that, there was the understanding that everyone can, one, be justified and sanctified, maybe even perfected, and go to heaven. So it does lead down that avenue as well, if you want to go down there. On the non-Christian side of things, I've heard some people take away the God in that phrase and replace it with the word good. And so you have the phrase that of good in everyone. So then I think it's very clear that there is a link there between the consciousness and basic human dignity and the phrase that of God in everyone. I'm interested and sometimes want to calm people down with these sort of reimagining of phrases, because whenever we do this, and I hope this is what you're seeing, is that a phrase gets reinterpreted, but things are lost. Things are gained sometimes, but also things can be lost. And so I'm wondering, well, okay, if we replace good, if we replace God with good, what are we losing from that? I think the first thing that we're losing, and I mentioned this in my video on the inner light and that term is we're losing the direction and we're muddling the direction of that. If we replace the phrase that of God with that of good, then we are internalizing the goodness. We're sort of saying, we're not saying that, everyone's good or whatever, but we're encouraging ourselves to look for that which is good in everyone. It's about, again, this innate human um, worth that everyone has, that you are inherently good at the center of your being. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. And I think that's very important. And I think it's very good that we look to try and see people that way, as inherently good rather than inherently bad. That's good. However, I think also that there's the tendency there of putting ourselves at the center of things. And that's problematic as well, because same with the idea of inner light versus inward light, whereas inward light is an external coming in, and inner light is already within us, so it can be linked to our consciousness. Similarly with that of God versus that of good. If it's that of good, it's about us. It's about us as individuals and how we recognize goodness in other people. Whereas that of God, we're not, and Quakers have never said that we are God or we have God in us actually, but rather that we have this ability to connect with that of God. And we can answer that of God in everyone and ourselves, I suppose. And so that it's an idea of the idea of direction, I think, gets a bit muddled as well if we look at that phrase and change God for good. So how did that change happen then? How did we get from a Foxite understanding of the phrase that of God in everyone to a 21st century Quaker understanding of that of God in everyone? Well, it seems to me that from what I've read, that it is pretty much down to one man, and that man is Rufus Jones. And he's quite a controversial figure. I've got quite a lot of time for him, but he was a Quaker at the turn of the 20th century who, along with people like W.H. Braithwaite and John William Rowntree, were effectively responsible for starting what we now know as modern liberal Quakerism. He has some funky views, some views that have been disregarded, but what they were all three of them trying to really do was to make Quakerism work with the modern world and to bring Quakerism back into the world as well. We've had the long period of Quietism. We've had maybe the two biblical, literal evangelical Quakerism of the 19th century, and so they're looking to bring Quakerism back into an understanding of a modern understanding of science and welfare and society and things like that. So some of his views are strange and have been criticized by historians and theologians and things like that. But one thing that he did do was he did change a lot of these phrases. So the phrase "inner light" has been coined as a Jonesian change. It has always existed, but the change from inward to inner was something that it has been claimed is what he led that change. And he also led to a change of the understanding of that of God. Something that is quite important to understand here as well is that Rufus Jones doesn't necessarily big up George Fox very much. He is quite critical of George Fox in quite a lot of ways. He much rather sees Quakerism to be influenced by European mystics rather than through George Fox necessarily. So he's already coming from a position where he wants to change what George Fox is trying to say. And so what he does is he takes this phrase, that of God in everyone, and he sees this as a way of linking it with universalism, the idea that the spirit of God reaches every man, I think is a phrase that comes from Rufus Jones. So again, the idea that it is about universalism. It's about the idea that we are all equal. It's about the idea that we are that we all have worth. Where against Fox's more understanding of listening to that of God and everyone, responding to that and being responsible as well to that of God and everyone. I think finally, probably one of the things that I feel that maybe needs to be recaptured with the phrase that of God and everyone is the idea that it's a mystical thing. If we get too entrapped with the idea that that is just about human goodness and that we are all equal, which I don't want to put down, that's a great message, and the more people that listen to that, the better. But I think that what we do forget is that that is a very mystical thing. We have a connection. We can't really explain it in real terms. We can use the phrase inward light. We can use the phrase that of God. It's all trying to get down to this mystical connection between us and the divine, and how we communicate with that. And that is not a normal human experience. That is a extra human experience which we don't have the words for. And we create words, and then we misunderstand them, and we reinterpret them, and we reinterpret them, and so on. But it's fundamentally a mystical experience. It is something which if we downplay, we've got a problem in that it takes away our story, and um, it takes away what makes Quakerism alive. If it becomes simply a call to social equality, that's not the same as saying that we believe that we can connect with God, and we don't need to do that through priests and sacraments and things like that. We can do that, and Christ has come to teach his people himself and all that sort of stuff. If we take that all away and just say it's about connectedness, it's about human worth, not that that's wrong, as I keep saying, is it losing maybe what makes Quakers unique in what they're trying to say? That's something that I'm just thinking about. Yeah, I still don't know I know what it means, but I think a lot of stuff to consider. It's a huge phrase to unpack, and I've tried to do it as succinctly as I can. And as I said, this is the third attempt. Who knows if this one will ever make it online? But I want to talk about it because I think it's a phrase that's got a lot to offer, and I think I like that it has multiple meanings, although that makes it really complicated. I like that that we try to understand it and that we apply meaning to it, and that meaning has changed. That's fine. That's sort of what we're saying about uh, constant revelation as well. We don't think that the final word's been said, um, and so therefore we phrases. Maybe the final understanding of a phrase has not been said yet. Maybe, yes, George Fox said something and it meant something then, and that was very helpful and very useful and very spiritual. And now it means this, and that helps us very well in terms of our understanding of our testimonies and things like that. Maybe in 100 years it'll mean something completely different, and that's fine. I think we have to be open with that. I keep saying Quakers need to be open to understanding new ways and new lights and things like that, and we can only do that if we look at a phrase and say, well, this is how I think it speaks to me, and then if someone else turns around and says something different, then that doesn't negate your understanding of that phrase. It can only add to it because you've developed your understanding as well. You might not necessarily think that's the way to interpret it, but your understanding as a whole, as a Quaker, is developing, and that's what's important. So thank you very much for listening. Hope you managed to make it to the end, so you finally now know what that of God in everyone is. But yes, please do have a look at some of I put some articles down below. These were some of the things that I was reading to help me get there. And obviously, if you think there's anything else that you think is really important in the understanding of that of God in everyone, please throw it in. Maybe I'll have to do it all over again. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up button, and do check out some of my other videos about Quakerism in the UK. If you want to keep up to date with the latest videos, please do remember to subscribe as well. It really helps. Thank you.